Why is it so difficult to play Hindemith's works? At first sight, it seems like it's um, very straightforward. We see there's very difficult passages, virtuosic passages, and our instinct is to play everything as accurate and as rhythmical as we can in order to then feel that we are being faithful to the piece. The reason why it's so difficult to interpret Hindemith's music is because he's placed in history in a very awkward spot. Before him, there's the Romanticism, the kind of style, romantic style of playing, and also Romanticism in expressing feeling, in being subjective, in being human, right? In looking at life from a human perspective. And in this, I include also Expressionism, which was also very much influenced by this. But then after him, we also have serialism, and we have much more of a mathematical approach to music. And there's a tendency for composers to write, to heavily mark their music and to demand from the musicians to really play with precision what's written in the score in order to achieve the results that the composers are intending. But where Hindemith is placed, there's a huge protest against Romanticism. It might be to do with the war. There was a necessity to look at life from a more realistic perspective. And Hindemith was a huge advocate of this. And in Germany, there was a branch of neoclassicism called New Objectivity, which was based on creating caricatures of life with still the techniques of the old masters. But maybe not so much in music. Maybe this is more to do with art. But certainly there was a need to look back into the classical periods and also further back to the Baroque period, which is called Neo-Baroque. And this is where I'm coming to. Hindemith was a huge, passionate of Bach's music. He loved Bach. It might have been to do with his teacher, Mendelssohn, who was descendant from the Mendelssohn we all know. And he had a deep passion also for Bach and his music. And he might have communicated this to Hindemith. And so we see a lot of him in his music. So what we're going to do now is we're going to listen again to the beginning of his piece, to the beginning of the first movement of Kammermusik No.5. And I would like you to try to guess what work by Bach he was influenced by. Did you guess what piece I'm talking about? I have to say it took me a little bit of time for me to find it. Initially, I was just looking into a lot of Bach's pieces, but of course he's got so much. He's written so many works. But then I remembered the three-note motif, which Hindemith uses, this rhythmical motif that keeps appearing and developing throughout the movement. And this brought me to Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3, which is what we're going to listen to a little bit now. So far, we have compared Walton to Hindemith, as in he might have taken elements from Hindemith and incorporated them into his concerto. But now we're going to the other side of the chain. Now we are going to see what is it from this movement from the Brandenburg Concerto that Hindemith, that got Hindemith so inspired, and that way try to understand a little bit more his style of composing, perhaps a little bit more of his of how we should interpret his music, and what this new objectivity style is about. The first thing we might notice is the three-note motif, which we've mentioned earlier already. And this is what Bach does here, is that he develops this motif throughout the movement, and it appears over and over. And why he does this is because it creates a kind of polyphony that makes the piece sound very busy, and also have a unity, because it's a motif that we know and we keep hearing. And this is something that Hindemith employs as well. I feel the way he uses this three-note motif that keeps developing is very much uh, trying to capture this same idea. The next thing we might be able to see is the Alabreve. And now we've got three ways of writing the same, perhaps the same tempo. I think if a listener were listening to this, they might not be able to tell what's the difference between one or the other, if they're necessarily different in tempo, unless our interpretation, of course, that is able to vary. But it's taking a little bit from Hindemith and a little bit from Walton. Walton uses the subdivision of semiquaver, but of course he's in a 2/4, which is an evolution of Alabreve. Alabreve in modern times is more used as a 2/4. We don't see so much 2/2 anymore. But in Hindemith's Alabreve, he's using the subdivision of quaver. So his bar is in a way smaller. And so the Alabreve that Bach is using is almost like double Hindemith's bar. But even then, doesn't necessarily mean that the tempo should be any different. And actually, it might be one of the reasons why Hindemith is giving so much freedom with his tempo. What he's trying to say is he doesn't want it faster than 1/12, but he does give us the chance to explore different tempos and find the one that is comfortable for us underneath that. The next thing you might be able to see is the upbeat motif. It's written again and it keeps repeating. This upbeat motif is what keeps the movement poised, grounded, whatever you want to call it, but it's a resource. Also, the movement is quite stable with it, but this is a resource I feel Hindemith also takes. Because he wants his music also, again, to make us feel that he's saying two ways, in two different ways, the same thing. He's writing it in the tempo marking, but he's also writing it in the music. He doesn't want this music to go flying away. Instead, he wants a kind of grounded feeling to it. And the last rhythmical element we can tell, which we've already looked at before, is the rhythmic ostinato, which gives the energy, the life to this movement, and which we can also hear in Hindemith's music. This is the thing about analysis, which makes it so great, is that when we understand what is the meaning behind different elements in the score, we might be able to understand many more pieces than just the one we're playing. Now we listen to Bach and we're able to tell this is what Hindemith is trying to aim with his Kammermusik No.5. He's trying to aim for this kind of texture because everything together, all these rhythmic elements, but also harmony. For example, if we look at the texture, if we hear Bach and we hear Hindemith's music, we can hear that the texture is very transparent. It's very see-through. And what we can see from Bach's music is that he uses a lot of unisons and octaves to start with, which makes the music very light and not very dense, like we might see in Walton, because he likes using more chords with more notes. He has a tendency, I'm not saying that he always does that, but he has a tendency to use uh, more chords. But in Hindemith's system, the unison and the octaves were the most pure chords. So it's normal that he might use this in combination to a reduced orchestration, which is smaller than a regular orchestra. This might give us a kind of similar texture that makes it sound neoclassical, neo-Baroque in this case. It makes it sound uh, very transparent, energized, and also light. Light, we could also say elegant. And where we see this is in the articulation. We've seen earlier that there were a lot of difference in articulations between Hindemith and Walton, and I will get back to that later. But certainly when Hindemith writes staccatissimo in his accompaniment, but also writes dots on and accents even on the solo line. I don't think, and I feel many people play these as most rhythmical and technical as possible, but I feel these trying to imitate the Baroque period could have actually much more of a flexibility, like we would interpret in Bach, which we don't just play notes, like separate notes. Just because he hasn't written any information for how those notes should be played. But in a way, you have the freedom of the interpretation. What Hindemith wants is for you to play elegant and to play light, but you might be able to disagree. The last thing I could say is dynamic. We, of course, there's a tendency to play the Brandenburg Concerto pretty full in sound. There's no dynamic, and also the instruments of the time, the room music was played. You didn't have to project so much at the time because of the texture and how he's written it, that he's imitated that from Bach. It means that in Hindemith, the soloist, the main part, doesn't actually need to make such a big effort to actually play above the orchestra. But I feel the dynamics and why the fortissimo and why this is not about tanking those notes like we often do. Because it's fortissimo, we have to play very loud. But I feel in the case of Hindemith, he just is referring to the room. Now we are not playing anymore in small rooms, but now we are more often playing in big concert halls. So maybe if you're playing a concerto with an orchestra, you might have to project more than it must have been done at the time in order to get to the last row, like we often, like we we need to, right, in order to be heard. So here are some elements from Hindemith's music that can be traced back to Bach and his music and his way of composing, and why we are able to tell that Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 was used for this movement.